Heartless millionaire kicks his wife out of the house because she can't have children. 7 years later, he's shocked to see his ex-wife with twins who look exactly like him. The Warburton estate was cloaked in an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor marked the passing minutes like a judge announcing a sentence. William Warburton sat in the library, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared at a tumbler of untouched bourbon on the mahogany desk before him. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth failing to reach the cold knot tightening in his chest. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. "She's barren, William. Do you understand what that means for this family? For the Warburton name? It's time to end this charade before it costs you everything. Everything." Kimberly Warburton, regal and unbending, had stood before him like a figure carved from ice. She hadn't raised her voice. She never needed to. Her words sliced through the air with precision, designed to cut, not wound. "You're the head of this family now," she continued, each syllable deliberate. "A Warburton doesn't cling to dead weight, especially not a girl from nowhere with no bloodline, no connections, and no heirs." William's jaw tightened. "Lucy is my wife." Kimberly had waved her manicured hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. "And she's had 3 years to fulfill her role. Don't have a single child. How much longer are you willing to let this continue before it ruins you? Ruins us?" William felt the pressure of his mother's expectations crushing him like a vice. He clenched his fists until the knuckles whitened, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Lucy hummed softly as she folded laundry in the small sitting room, sunlight streaming through the bay window. The soft notes of her voice filled the space, weaving a fragile piece into the fabric of the day. She glanced at the clock, her expression softening. William would be home soon. Her hands moved rhythmically, but her mind wandered. She thought of the way William used to smile at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, like he couldn't contain his joy. Lately, that smile had become scarce, replaced by a tension she didn't know how to soothe. The weight of their unspoken failures, particularly hers, hovered between them like a specter. The door creaked open, and William's footsteps echoed down the hall. She looked up, her heart quickening with both relief and apprehension. He hesitated in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the dim light of the corridor. "You're home early," Lucy said, her tone light but tinged with nervousness. She set down the shirt she had been folding and wiped her hands on her apron. "I was thinking we could—" "Lucy." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped her mid-sentence. She froze, her smile faltering. William stepped into the room, his gaze darting to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. His hands found the back of a chair, gripping it tightly. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strained, "about us." Her brows knit together and she stepped closer. "William, what's wrong?" The tenderness in her voice, which had once grounded him, now twisted him with guilt. He forced himself to look at her, her delicate features, the way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, her eyes full of concern. I think we need to separate." The words dropped like stones into the fragile stillness of the room. For a moment, Lucy didn't move, didn't breathe. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you saying this?" William's throat tightened. He struggled to express the truth to her, realizing that his mother's ultimatum had compelled him to act, and his love for her was insufficient to overcome the burden of the Warburton name. Instead, he leaned into the lie that had been rehearsed in his head, though it tasted like ash on his tongue. "This isn't working, Lucy. It's been 3 years, and we're not building the life we hoped for." Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "William, we can fix this. We can—" "It's not something we can fix," he interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "It's just over." Lucy's breath hitched, and she stepped back as if he had struck her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, the place where life had never taken root. The gesture made William's chest ache, but he didn't reach for her. The clock chimed softly, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Lucy finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Is this because of me? Because I—" "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's just what has to be." She stood there, her frame fragile yet unbroken. "If you walk away from me, William, I don't think I'll ever forgive you." William swallowed hard, the weight of her words crashing over him. But he turned away, his steps heavy as he left the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house like the final note of a funeral dirge. In the empty silence that followed, Lucy sank into the chair he had gripped moments earlier. The warmth of his touch lingered on the wood, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The storm outside the Warburton estate mirrored the chaos in Lucy's chest. Rain lashed against the tall windows, streaking the glass like tears. She stood in the foyer, her small suitcase by her feet, trembling fingers wrapped around the handle. William was perched on the edge of the staircase, his back rigid as if the banister behind him held him upright. He avoided her gaze, staring somewhere beyond her shoulder, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "William," Lucy's voice broke, soft and raw. "Please just tell me why." His jaw tightened, a slight movement that revealed the tension coiled within him. He didn't answer. 3 years, William, her words spilled out, shaky but unrelenting. 3 years of a marriage you promised would stand against anything. You stood right there, she gestured toward the grand archway where they'd exchanged vows. And you told me we'd face every storm together. And now you're— Her voice cracked, faltering under the weight of her grief. "Now you're asking me to leave." "It's better this way," he muttered, still refusing to look at her. His tone clipped and cold, and it struck her like a slap. "Better for who?" she whispered, her breath hitching. "For your mother? For your legacy? What about us, William? What about me?" When he finally raised his gaze to hers, the steel in his eyes did not mitigate the impact. "This isn't about anyone else, Lucy. This is about what's right." Lucy staggered back a step, her chest tightening, as if the air had been stolen from the room. She scanned his face, desperate to find some trace of the man she had loved. The man who had once made her laugh so hard she cried, who had held her hand like it was the most sacred thing in the world. But he was gone, buried under the weight of expectations she couldn't fight. "Right," she repeated, the word dripping with bitterness. Her hand shook as she reached for the suitcase, lifting it with an effort that felt heavier than it should have. "If this is what you call right, then you've lost far more than just me, William." Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she moved toward the door. She paused, turning back one last time. Her gaze lingered on the man she had given everything to, her voice soft but resolute. "You'll regret this." As she stepped outside, the rain welcomed her with a cold slap. Her thin cardigan offered little protection against the elements, and the wind bit at her cheeks, sending shivers down her spine. The suitcase banged against her legs as she trudged down the driveway, the grand Warburton estate looming behind her like a hollow shell. Lucy didn't look back. The train rumbled as it crossed into the Chicago city limits, its wheels humming a rhythm that seemed to echo her thoughts. Lucy stared out the window, her reflection blurred against the rain-slicked glass. The city's towering skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the overcast sky. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, the weight of the small life she had packed pressing into her palm. It was all she had now. A few clothes, a worn photo of her wedding day tucked into the pocket of a coat she couldn't bring herself to wear anymore, and a growing ache in her chest. The train pulled into the station with a metallic groan. Passengers bustled around her, brushing past in a flurry of umbrellas and hurried steps. Lucy remained seated for a moment, her breath shallow, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Ma'am," a conductor's polite voice jolted her. "This is the last stop." She nodded quickly, standing on unsteady legs. The platform was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of wet concrete and the faint tang of diesel. She followed the crowd into the city, her steps uncertain but deliberate. Lucy wandered through the unfamiliar streets of Chicago, the weight of her loneliness pressing down with every step. The towering buildings seemed to swallow her, their shadows casting her into a sea of strangers. With shaking hands, she found a modest hotel off a quieter street and paid for a week's stay. The room was small, its walls a faded beige, but it was warm and dry. She dropped her suitcase by the bed and sank onto the mattress, her head falling into her hands. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. The enormity of what she had lost washed over her, drowning her in waves of grief and exhaustion. But as the night wore on, a strange stillness settled over her. Her tears dried, leaving only the faint tremor in her chest. She lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her breathing steadying. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow I'll figure it out. The city outside hummed with life, its heartbeat steady and relentless. For the first time in weeks, Lucy let herself close her eyes, holding on to the smallest flicker of resilience. She was still here, and that, for now, was enough. Lucy stirred awake to a dull devoid of passion, a hollow gesture for the sake of appearances. Later at the reception, William stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of champagne in hand. He stared at the flames, their warmth failing to reach him. Around him guests mingled, offering congratulations that felt more like obligations. Victoria flitted between conversations, her laughter polite but strained. She caught his eye briefly, her smile faltering before she turned away. William took a long sip of his drink, the bitterness burning his throat. His thoughts drifted to Lucy. He pictured her the way she had looked the last time he saw her, rain-soaked, her suitcase in hand, her eyes filled with heartbreak. The memory clawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Regret wouldn't change the path he had chosen. Kimberly was completely comfortable in her surroundings. She moved through the room with practiced ease, basking in the compliments of her peers. A perfect match, they said. The Warburtons and the Whites, what a union! Her lips curved into a satisfied smile as she glanced at William and Victoria standing side by side, like chess pieces she had expertly positioned. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Victoria gave birth to a baby girl 9 months later. The nursery, once filled with anticipation, grew cold as Kimberly's disappointment became clear. Haley, Victoria had named her, the name chosen without Kimberly's input. Kimberly's reaction was subtle but biting. "A daughter," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Well, at least she's beautiful." Victoria stiffened, cradling Haley closer. "She's perfect," she replied, her tone edged with defiance. Kimberly offered a tight smile, but her dissatisfaction was evident. Haley wasn't the heir she had envisioned. Kimberly's subtle criticisms grew sharper over time. Comments about Haley's delicate health, her temperament, even the way Victoria parented. Only fleeting glances and clipped conversations revealed the simmering tension beneath the surface. William, meanwhile, found himself adrift. His days were consumed by the routines of his family's business, his nights by the emptiness of his home. The marriage to Victoria was polite but distant. They spoke in pleasantries, their interactions careful and controlled. Victoria, he realized, was as much a prisoner of this union as he was. In the quiet hours, William's mind wandered back to Lucy. He often found himself reaching for the drawer in his office where a single photograph lay hidden. It was from their honeymoon, Lucy laughing, her hair windswept, her eyes bright with joy. He would trace his thumb over her image, the ache in his chest sharpening with each glance. He wondered where she was, what she was doing. Did she hate him? Was she happy? The questions haunted him, their answers out of reach. One night as he sat alone in the study, Haley's cries echoed faintly down the hall. Victoria's soothing voice followed, soft but weary. William stared into his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. His life, he realized, was a carefully curated facade. The legacy his mother had demanded he protect felt like a gilded cage, each golden bar forged from choices he couldn't undo. He stood, the photograph still in his hand, and walked to the window. The city lights sprawled out before him, a reminder of all the possibilities he had forsaken. Somewhere out there, she was living a life beyond his reach. The thought both comforted and tormented him, William pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night, though no one was there to hear. The Warburton mansion maintained its grandeur, yet the fissures beneath its exterior widened daily. Kimberly's iron grip on the family began to falter as Victoria grew more defiant, determined to shield Haley from her mother-in-law's cutting expectations. William drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound, and in the shadows of his gilded life, the memory of Lucy burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Lucy's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of the work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Andrew first walked in. Lucy was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Lucy nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. William drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound, and in the shadows of his gilded life, the memory of Lucy burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Lucy's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of the work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Andrew first walked in. Lucy was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Lucy nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. "Thanks," he said, his hazel eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Lucy offered a polite nod, then turned her attention to the next customer. Andrew sat near the window, pulling out a small notebook as the steam from his coffee curled upward. Their paths crossed again a week later, this time under less mundane circumstances. Lucy was at the playground with Carl and Oliver, the twins giggling as they toddled after each other in the damp grass. A sharp cry broke the peace as Carl tripped, falling face first onto the ground. "Carl!" Lucy rushed to him, scooping him up. Blood trickled from a small cut on his knee, and his wails grew louder. Panic bubbled in her chest. She had nothing but a tissue in her pocket, and no idea how to properly clean the wound. "Here," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Andrew jogging toward them, a small first aid kit in hand. He crouched down, his coat brushing the ground as he opened the kit with practiced ease. "I'm a doctor," he explained, glancing up briefly as he pulled out an antiseptic wipe. "May I?" Lucy hesitated, then nodded. Andrew cleaned the wound with gentle precision, murmuring softly to Carl to distract him. "There we go. All better," he said, securing a bandage in place. Carl's sobs had subsided into hiccups, his tear-streaked face now full of curiosity, as he stared at Andrew. "Thank you," Lucy said quietly, her voice edged with both gratitude and exhaustion. Andrew stood, brushing off his knees. "It's no trouble. I work at the clinic down the street. I see little ones like this all the time." Over the weeks that followed, Andrew's presence became a quiet but steady part of Lucy's life. He stopped by the cafe regularly, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes with a small gift for the boys, coloring books, toy cars, things he claimed were just lying around. Lucy found herself talking to him more, their conversations light and unassuming at first. They talked about Chicago winters, the best coffee spots in the city, and the occasional chaos of raising toddlers. Andrew listened more than he spoke, his questions thoughtful, and his laughter easy. One day as they sat outside during a rare warm afternoon, Andrew leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've built something special here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the cafe and the bustling street. "It's not easy raising two boys on your own." Lucy's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She gave a small shrug, her voice guarded. "You do what you have to." Andrew didn't press, sensing the wall she had quietly erected. Instead, he shifted the conversation, telling her about his time working in a small rural hospital and the quirks of his patients there. Lucy found herself smiling despite herself, the tension easing from her shoulders. Andrew's affection for Lucy grew in the small moments when she carefully tucked a blanket around a sleeping Oliver at the cafe, or when her laugh, rare but genuine, lit up her face. But he never said anything, aware of the guardedness in her every gesture, the way she avoided speaking about her past. One evening as they walked back from the park with the twins, Andrew spoke softly. "You know, Lucy, you don't always have to carry everything alone." She stopped, her hands tightening on the stroller handle. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment she didn't respond. "It's not about carrying it alone," she said finally, her voice steady but distant. "It's about knowing you can't drop it." Andrew didn't push, but the look he gave her was one of quiet understanding. They continued walking in silence, the twins babbling softly to each other in the stroller. Lucy appreciated Andrew's presence, but she couldn't allow herself to lean on him, no matter how much easier it might make things. Her scars ran too deep, her trust too fragile. Yet as weeks turned into months, she found herself looking forward to their conversations, their quiet moments of companionship. Andrew never pried, never pushed. He was there, steady and patient like the tide. And while Lucy's heart remained guarded, a small part of her began to wonder if perhaps she didn't have to face the world entirely alone. The windy city greeted William Warburton with its characteristic blend of noise, steel, and endless motion. He stepped off the train with his briefcase in hand, the worn leather a testament to years of business trips and negotiations. Chicago wasn't unfamiliar, but this time its streets felt different. The towering buildings seemed more oppressive, the bustling crowds a stark contrast to the isolation he carried within. He adjusted his tie, loosening it slightly as he checked his phone for the itinerary Kimberly had meticulously curated. A meeting with investors, a dinner with potential clients, the usual grind. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest, as suffocating as ever. Yet beneath it all was a hollow ache, a void that the success Kimberly lorded could never fill. Later that afternoon, his meeting concluded earlier than expected. William wandered through Millennium Park, his polished shoes incongruous against the worn concrete paths. The laughter of children rang out across the open spaces, their voices punctuated by the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through budding trees. It was uncharacteristic of him to linger, but something about the park's energy stilled his typically restless mind. As he approached a bench near a playground, a flash of movement caught his eye. A woman crouched beside two young boys. They were laughing, their identical faces glowing with delight as they tussled over a toy truck. William froze mid-step, his breath hitching. The woman turned her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her profile was unmistakable, etched in his memory like an indelible mark. Lucy. 7 years had passed since she left. William's chest tightened, his gaze darted to the boys again, their features now under closer scrutiny. His heart thudded against his ribs as realization struck. Their sandy brown hair, the sharp line of their jaws, even the way one boy furrowed his brows in concentration. It was as if he were looking at his own childhood photographs. William retreated to a bench several yards away, sitting heavily as he tried to steady his breath. He observed the unfolding scene from the edge of his vision. Lucy laughed softly as she helped one boy zip his jacket, the other clinging to her arm. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the gestures of a mother deeply attuned to her children's needs. Guilt clawed at him, raw and relentless. He had done this. He had pushed her away, abandoned her to a world where she'd had to face this alone. And yet here she was, resilient and radiant in a way he didn't deserve to witness. He felt like an intruder, his presence an unwelcome shadow in her sunlit world. The curiosity gnawed at him, relentless and insidious. How had she ended up here? Had she ever thought of him? And the boys, were they his? The following days found William distracted, his work a blur of half-hearted conversations and hollow pleasantries. He returned to the park more than once, each time keeping his distance, watching Lucy from afar. He noticed the way she carried herself, her movements confident but edged with a subtle caution. She spoke gently to the boys, her words laced with patience and warmth. One afternoon, as Lucy corralled the boys toward a nearby cafe, William followed at a careful distance. The sign above the door read, "Bean and Brew," its chipped paint a stark contrast to the glossy coffee shops he frequented. Through the window, he saw Lucy behind the counter, her apron tied snugly around her waist as she handed a steaming mug to a customer. William lingered outside, the chill in the air seeping into his skin. He couldn't bring himself to go in. The questions swirling in his mind felt too heavy, the confrontation too sudden. Instead, he resolved to uncover the truth another way. That evening, back at his hotel, William pored over documents he had requested through a private investigator. The reports were concise but revealing. Lucy had moved to Chicago shortly after their separation, taking up modest work while raising two boys, Carl and Oliver. Their ages aligned uncomfortably close to the timeline of their last days together. William's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. The truth was undeniable. They were his. He felt a heavy burden of regret. Images of their time together resurfaced. Lucy's laughter, her gentle touch, the way she had looked at him with unwavering trust. He had destroyed that trust, and in doing so, he had missed 6 years of a life he might have had. The photo of Lucy with Carl and Oliver that accompanied the report seemed to taunt him. The boys stood on either side of her, their grins wide, their eyes shining with the kind of joy that William hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The hollow life he had built, his marriage to Victoria, his role as the dutiful Warburton heir, felt meaningless in the face of this new reality. The next morning, William found himself back at the park. Lucy was there as usual, her boys chasing each other around the swings. This time William didn't stay in the shadows. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, the weight of 7 years of guilt and longing pressing against his chest. "Lucy," he called softly. She turned, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. For a moment neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the laughter of children fading into the background. "William," she finally said, her voice steady but guarded. And just like that, the past collided with the present, their lives once again entwined in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Lucy stood frozen, her gaze locked on William. The playground's warmth, the laughter of children, the chatter of parents faded into a dull hum, eclipsed by the weight of his presence. He looked older, his once proud posture tempered by something softer, something broken. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp like a blade held ready. William hesitated, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. "I'm here for work," he said, his tone quiet. "I didn't know. I didn't expect—" He glanced at Carl and Oliver, who were now watching curiously from the swings. His voice faltered. "They're mine, aren't they?" Lucy's jaw tightened, her hands instinctively moving to her sides, shielding her sons from the weight of his words. "It doesn't matter," she said coldly. "You made your choice years ago." William flinched at her tone, the guilt he'd been carrying swelling into something unbearable. "I didn't know—" "Lucy, I didn't know about them." She moved forward, her voice reduced to a harsh whisper. "You didn't know because you didn't care to ask. You threw me away like I was nothing, William, and now after 7 years you think you can just waltz back into my life?" William's gaze dropped to the ground. "It wasn't like that," he murmured, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Oh, wasn't it?" Lucy snapped, her voice rising. "Because from where I stood, it was exactly like that. You chose your family, your legacy, and your precious image over me, over us." The raw pain in her words pierced William more deeply than he expected. He struggled for something to say, some way to explain the years of silence, the regret that had gnawed at him every day since she left. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I was weak, and I'm sorry." Lucy's expression softened for a brief moment before hardening again. "Sorry isn't enough," she said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. "Not after everything I've been through. Not after everything they've been through." William glanced at the boys again. Carl was whispering to Oliver, their small faces a perfect mirror of his own childhood. "I just want to be part of their lives," he said. "I don't want to take them away from you, Lucy. I just want to be there." Her laugh was bitter, her head shaking. "Be there? Like you were there for me, like you were there when I was pregnant and terrified and completely alone?" She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to swoop in now and act like some savior." William took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking for a chance. For them. For you." Lucy's lips tightened into a thin line. "There is no us, William. Not anymore. I've moved on." The words hit him like a punch and he stiffened. "You're seeing someone?" "Yes," she said, her tone unwavering. "Andrew? He's kind, dependable, and he doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get hard." William's jaw clenched. The name stung not because he knew Andrew, but because it confirmed that Lucy had built a life without him, a life he had no part in. "I'm glad," he said finally, though the words felt bitter in his mouth. "But I still want to be there for Carl and Oliver." Lucy's stance remained firm. "You don't get to disrupt their lives because of your guilt. They're happy, William. They have stability, love, and a home. What can you offer them? A father who walked away before they were even born." His chest tightened, but he refused to back down. A chance to know the truth, to know their father. Lucy sighed, her exhaustion permeating her resolve. "And what happens when you go back to New York? Back to your wife, your mother? Do you really think you can be the father they need while you're tangled in the life you chose?" William's face paled at her words, but he didn't falter. "I just want to try, even if it's only as a friend. Please, Lucy." She studied him for a long moment, her heart warring with itself. A part of her yearned to permanently close this chapter of her life. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter part, that still longed for some semblance of closure, for her boys to know their father, if only in fragments. "Fine," she said at last, her voice low and clipped. "But on my terms, and the moment I think this is hurting them, you're gone." William nodded, a wave of relief sweeping over him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me," Lucy said sharply, turning to gather her boys. "This isn't for you." William stood motionless as she walked away, Carl and Oliver gripping her hands tightly. The weight of his choices hung heavy around him, but for the first time in years he felt a spark of hope. Small, tentative, and fragile, but there. Kimberly Warburton had never been one to tolerate uncertainty. Information was her currency, and she had long mastered the art of unearthing secrets. The truth about Carl and Oliver came to her through carefully placed whispers, an unnamed informant from William's business dealings in Chicago. The news confirmed what she had long suspected. William's departure from tradition had not been without consequence. "Two boys," Kimberly murmured, her voice cold and calculating as she stared at the report in her hands. The investigator's photographs of Carl and Oliver glared back at her. Two strikingly familiar faces, their resemblance to William undeniable. Her lips curled into a faint smile, the edges of her satisfaction tempered by disdain. She dismissed the file onto her ornate desk and glanced toward a family portrait on the mantel. Haley's cherubic face stared back at her, framed by Victoria's proud but weary smile. Kimberly's own expression in the photograph was poised, perfect, an illusion she no longer cared to maintain. "A daughter," she scoffed under her breath, her tone dripping with disappointment. Haley was an afterthought, a placeholder in a lineage that demanded strong male heirs. Carl and Oliver were different. They were the future of the Warburton legacy, and Kimberly was determined to bring them into the fold, whether Lucy agreed or not. Victoria White Warburton had grown used to the quiet battles that played out in the Warburton household. Kimberly's sharp remarks disguised as advice, William's distracted silences, the constant suffocating weight of expectation. It all felt like an endless performance, and Victoria had been cast in a role she never auditioned for. But lately, the veneer had started to crack. She first noticed Kimberly's sudden interest in William's business trip to Chicago. The questions were subtle but pointed. The tension shifted when Kimberly returned from a private meeting, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a razor-sharp focus. "What's in Chicago, Kimberly?" Victoria asked one evening, her tone casual but probing as they sat in the parlor. Kimberly's smile was tight, dismissive. "Opportunity," she replied. "For William, for the family, that's all you need to know." Victoria's unease deepened over the following weeks. Kimberly's disdain for Haley became more pronounced, her remarks cutting deeper than before. Perhaps if she were more disciplined, Kimberly mused once, after Haley spilled her juice. Another time, a shame she's not a boy. The Warburtons need stability. The implication stung, but Victoria's growing frustration turned into resolve. Haley wasn't Kimberly's pawn. She wasn't going to let her daughter or herself be molded into something they weren't. The plane touched down in Chicago, and Kimberly stepped into the city with purpose. The limousine pulled up in front of Lucy's modest apartment, a stark contrast to the Warburton estate's grandeur. Kimberly stepped out, her tailored coat pristine, her expression as frosty as the January air. Lucy watched her approach from the window, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. Andrew stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice steady. Lucy nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes." Kimberly's knock was precise, and Lucy opened the door to meet her former mother-in-law's piercing gaze. "Lucy," Kimberly said smoothly, her tone almost cordial, "we need to talk." Andrew stepped forward, his presence a quiet but solid wall. Kimberly's eyes flicked to him briefly, dismissing him as one might a piece of furniture. "I see you've moved on," she said, her voice edged with mock civility. Lucy declined the invitation. "What do you want, Kimberly?" Kimberly stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the humble space with thinly veiled disdain. "Carl and Oliver," she said bluntly. "They belong with their father's family." Lucy's breath caught, but she refused to let Kimberly see her falter. "They belong with me," she said firmly. "They've always belonged with me." Kimberly arched an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "And you've done admirably, given your circumstances. But let's be realistic, Lucy. The Warburton name offers them opportunities you could never dream of." Lucy stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's best for them. You didn't care about them when I was pregnant, and you don't care about them now. You only care about what they can do for you." Kimberly's smile was thin, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Don't be naive. You think your little life here is enough for them? What happens when they start asking questions, when they realize what they're missing?" "They're missing nothing," Andrew interjected, his voice calm but firm. "They have a mother who loves them, and a life filled with stability. That's more than any title or name could give them." Kimberly's gaze shifted to him, her disdain sharpening. "And who are you to involve yourself in a family matters?" "I'm someone who cares about them," Andrew said evenly, "and someone who won't let you bulldoze over Lucy or her sons." Kimberly's composure cracked for a moment, her lips thinning into a harsh line. She turned back to Lucy, her voice colder than ever. "This isn't over. You can't keep them from their birthright." Lucy's heart pounded, but her resolve didn't waver. "Watch me." Kimberly's departure was as swift as her arrival, the door closing behind her with a sharp click. Lucy exhaled shakily, leaning into Andrew's steady presence. "She won't stop," she murmured, her voice trembling. No, Andrew agreed, his hand warm against her back. But neither will we. The Warburton mansion loomed in its usual oppressive grandeur as William stepped through the front door. The weight of his return to New York pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had barely set down his briefcase when Victoria appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed and her gaze sharp. "Kimberly went to Chicago, didn't she?" Victoria's voice was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath it. William froze, his jaw tightening. "Who told you?" "Haley heard her on the phone," Victoria said, stepping closer. Kimberly wasn't exactly subtle about her plans to secure the family's future. "I know she went after Lucy and your sons." William winced at the words, his hands clenching into fists. "Victoria, You knew," Victoria interrupted, her tone colder now. "You knew about them, about her, and you didn't think I deserved to know?" William sighed, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion etched across his face made him look older, more worn. "I didn't know until I went to Chicago," he admitted, his voice low. "I saw Lucy. I saw Carl and Oliver. I know they're mine." Victoria blinked, her composure faltering. "And you just kept this from me? From all of us?" "I didn't know how to tell you," William said, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't stop Kimberly. She's only thinking about the Warburton name, not what's best for anyone." Victoria stared at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice quieter but no less firm. "You'd better figure out what's best for you, William, before it's too late." The atmosphere in the Warburton mansion was tense, charged with unspoken words and growing resentment. Victoria sat in the parlor, Haley playing quietly on the floor. The sound of William's footsteps in the hallway made her shoulders tense. She had waited long enough. "William," she called, her voice calm but resolute. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside, his gaze wary. "What is it, Victoria?" She stood, crossing her arms. "We need to talk about Chicago, about Kimberly, about everything." William sighed, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on him. "Victoria, I already told you." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "You didn't tell me anything. You avoided the truth until there was no way to hide it. Kimberly's actions, the boys, Lucy, everything. And you let it happen." William's shoulders slumped, but he didn't defend himself. "I didn't know how to handle it," he admitted. Victoria's voice cracked with anger. "Of course you didn't, because you spent your entire life letting Kimberly dictate every move you make. And now she's dragging Haley and me down with you." William flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Victoria's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You knew what Kimberly was planning, and you did nothing to stop her. Haley is just a pawn to her, and you've allowed it. And now you expect me to stay and pretend everything is fine?" William opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of her accusations weighed too heavy. Victoria took a deep breath, her voice softening, but losing none of its resolve. "I'm leaving, William. I'm taking Haley, and we're starting over somewhere Kimberly can't control us, somewhere you can't let her." William's heart sank. "Victoria, please don't do this." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've left me no choice. I've tried to be patient, to protect Haley from this toxic family, but I won't let her grow up thinking she's not enough just because she's not what Kimberly wanted." William stepped forward, his voice pleading. "Victoria, I can change. I'll talk to Kimberly. It's too late, William," she said firmly. "I can't keep waiting for you to prioritize us over her. Haley deserves better. I deserve better." The following morning, Victoria packed quietly, her movements deliberate and careful. Haley sat on the bed, clutching a small stuffed bear, her big eyes watching her mother with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" Haley asked softly. Victoria knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart. A big adventure. Just you and me." Haley smiled faintly, the innocence in her expression breaking Victoria's heart. She hugged her tightly, whispering a promise to herself to give Haley a life free from the suffocating grasp of the Warburton name. William stood in the foyer as Victoria descended the grand staircase with their suitcases in tow. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, but he didn't stop her. He knew he had no right. "Goodbye, William," she said quietly, her tone devoid of malice, but heavy with finality. He watched as she walked out the door, Haley's hand in hers. The sound of the car engine starting and fading into the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The knock on Lucy's apartment door was sharp and deliberate. Andrew's brows furrowed as he glanced toward Lucy, who stood frozen, her hand tightening around a dish towel. She didn't need to ask who it was. "I'll get it," Andrew said, stepping forward. "No," Lucy whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'll handle her." Kimberly Warburton stood on the threshold, her tailored coat impeccable, her expression as cold as the Chicago winter outside. "Lucy," she said smoothly, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "May I come in?" Lucy stepped outside, closing the door behind her to shield Carl and Oliver from Kimberly's presence. "We don't have anything to discuss," Lucy said firmly, folding her arms. "Oh, but we do," Kimberly replied, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Those boys are Warburtons. They deserve the opportunities this family can provide." Lucy's eyes narrowed, her voice rising. "They deserve a life where they're loved for who they are, not what they represent to someone like you." Kimberly tilted her head, her expression almost amused. "You really think this small life you've built is enough for them? With your companion?" Her gaze flicked dismissively to the closed door. "Playing the role of father? Don't be naive." Lucy stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's enough for my children. You don't get to come here and act like you care about them. They're not pawns in your power games, Kimberly. They're my sons, and they're staying with me." The door opened behind Lucy, and Andrew emerged, his presence solid and calm. "She's made herself clear," Andrew said, his voice firm. "You should leave." Kimberly's composure cracked, her lips thinning. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her cold arrogance faltering. "The Warburton name—" "Enough." The voice came from behind her, and Kimberly stiffened. William stood at the base of the apartment steps, his face pale but determined. He rushed back to Chicago after learning that his mother would bother Lucy. "Mother, let it go." Kimberly turned sharply, her disbelief evident. "William, this is about the family." "No," William interrupted, his voice steelier than Lucy had ever heard. "This is about you and your obsession with control. Let them go." Kimberly's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she saw the resolve in her son's eyes, and it unnerved her. With a final withering look, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. When Kimberly was gone, the tension between Lucy and William was palpable. Andrew stepped aside, his gaze flickering between them before retreating back into the apartment to give them privacy. "Thank you," Lucy said after a moment, her voice guarded. William nodded, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I didn't come here to fight, Lucy. I needed to make sure she wouldn't hurt you or them." Lucy crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Why now, William? Why not 7 years ago?" William's shoulders slumped. "Because I was a coward. Because I let her dictate my life. And I let you pay the price for it." He looked up, his gaze softening. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Lucy, but I don't want to make another one." Lucy's voice wavered with emotion. "What do you want, William?" "I want you to be happy," he said simply. "With Andrew, with the boys. I don't deserve to be part of their lives, not after everything I've done, but I'd like to be here, even if it's just from a distance, to see them grow up." Lucy studied him, her heart conflicted. The man before her was no longer the William she had known. Arrogant, controlled by ambition. He looked broken, remorseful, but there was something else in his eyes, sincerity. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she admitted, her voice quiet. William nodded. "I don't expect you to, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone worth forgiving." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lucy standing on the porch, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of closure. She turned back to the apartment where Andrew was waiting, with a quiet strength that steadied her. As she entered and shut the door, she sensed the burden of the past dissipating, creating space for the life she had tirelessly strived to establish. The sun was warm on Lucy's face as she walked hand in hand with Carl and Oliver through the park. Andrew strolled beside her, a soft smile playing on his lips as the boys dashed ahead to the playground. Their laughter rang out, bright and carefree, a melody that filled the once empty corners of Lucy's heart. "Watch me, Mom," Carl called, climbing the jungle gym with determination. "Be careful," Lucy called back, though her smile betrayed her pride. Andrew leaned closer, his voice low and teasing. "You know he's not going to slow down." Lucy laughed softly. "I know, but it's a mother's job to worry." Andrew reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers. "And you do it beautifully." Lucy experienced a complete release from the burden of her past for the first time in years. She glanced at Andrew, gratitude and love filling her gaze. This was her family now, a life she had built with resilience and a strength she never thought she possessed. Back in New York, William sat alone in his study, the Warburton mansion unnaturally quiet. On his desk lay a photo Lucy had sent of Carl and Oliver at the playground. He traced a finger over their smiling faces, a wistful ache settling in his chest. He glanced out the window at the sprawling estate, its grandeur hollow without the family he had lost. The echoes of Kimberly's ambition and his own cowardice reverberated through the empty halls. He was uncertain if the wound caused by Victoria's departure would ever heal, and Haley's laughter had become a distant memory he longed to reclaim. William knew he couldn't undo the years of pain he had caused, but he wasn't willing to lose more. A plane ticket to Los Angeles sat beside the photograph, Victoria's last known address scribbled in the corner. For once, William felt a spark of resolve, a determination to try to find Haley and Victoria, to make amends no matter how difficult the path. Kimberly sat alone in the grand parlor, the fire casting flickering shadows on her carefully composed face. She had driven away everyone she claimed to love, William, Victoria, and even Haley. The empire she had fought so hard to preserve now felt like an empty monument to her ambition. Reaching for the family portrait on the mantel, she ran her fingers over the timeless faces. For the first time in years, Kimberly's composure cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek. The legacy she had so fiercely protected had cost her everything. As twilight settled over Chicago, Lucy, Andrew, Carl, and Oliver sat on a picnic blanket beneath a canopy of stars. The boys huddled close, their eyes wide as Andrew spun a story about constellations and mythical creatures. Lucy watched them, her heart full. The past had scarred her, but it hadn't broken her. She had found love, laughter, and the kind of joy she once thought impossible. Andrew turned to her, his voice soft. "Are you happy?" Lucy smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered. "I really am." And as the stars twinkled above, Lucy knew that this was only the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful future.